Welcome, settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. There is nowhere you need to be for the next hour, and nothing you need to do. Tonight we are going to take a slow, quiet walk through one of the most extraordinary stories in human memory. The story of the Apollo program. The story of how, in a little more than a decade, a nervous and divided planet decided to send 12 of its own to stand on the surface of another world and to bring them safely home again. Close your eyes if you like. You do not have to follow every detail. You do not have to remember any of it. The voice will carry on, the story will carry on, and you can simply drift along beside it, the way you might drift beside a slow river on a warm summer afternoon. We will begin long before any rocket left the ground. We will begin in the dark autumn of 1957, when a small silver ball, no heavier than a bag of sugar, crossed the sky over America and changed everything. Breathe in and out, and we will begin. On the evening of October the 4th, 1957, a radio operator in Connecticut sat down at his desk, put on his headphones, and tuned his receiver to a frequency near 20 megahertz. He was expecting the usual quiet hum of the night sky. What he heard instead was a small, steady beep. A short, soft, rhythmic tone repeating every 0.3 of a second. Beep, beep, beep. High above him, passing over the dark Atlantic, was a polished aluminum sphere, roughly the size of a basketball, trailing 4 long antennas behind it like the whiskers of an enormous mechanical fish. It had been launched that same day from a secret test site in the deserts of Kazakhstan. Its name was Sputnik, from the Russian word for traveling companion. And for the first time in history, something made by human hands was circling the Earth. The beep itself was not carrying any secret information. It was just a tone, a simple signal chosen so that amateur radio operators all around the world could pick it up and confirm for themselves that yes, this small Soviet machine was really up there. Some of the engineers who designed it were uncertain the public would believe the news without that proof. They need not have worried. By morning, the beeps were on the front page of every newspaper in America. Children taped pieces of paper to their bedroom windows, trying to calculate the times Sputnik would pass overhead. Families carried radios into their backyards on cool autumn evenings, tuned to the strange frequency, and listened together. Some parents stood in the dark with coffee in their hands and did not know whether to feel wonder or fear, or both at the same time. For most Americans of that era, the Second World War had only recently ended. The scars of it were still quite fresh. The world had split in the years that followed into 2 uneasy halves. On one side stood the United States and its allies, on the other stood the Soviet Union. The 2 sides did not fire at each other directly, but they watched each other constantly, and each measured itself against the other in every possible way. And now, suddenly, on an ordinary Friday evening, the Soviet Union had done something the United States had not. It had placed a machine into orbit around the Earth. The response in America was difficult to describe. It was not quite panic. It was more like a long-held breath. Newspapers ran diagrams showing the orbit of Sputnik over a map of the United States. Politicians gave nervous speeches. Engineers and scientists who had been warning for years that America needed a larger space program found themselves suddenly welcomed into offices where, previously, they had waited for hours to be seen. A month later, the Soviet Union launched a second satellite. This one was much heavier than the first, and it carried a small dog named Laika. Her capsule was not designed to return. She died within hours, alone, in orbit, and the fact of her flight made the whole thing feel heavier still. The sky was no longer empty. It had become another country, and someone else had gotten there first. In December of that year, the United States attempted to answer with its own satellite, a small package called Vanguard. The launch was televised. The rocket lifted about 4 feet off the pad, then sank back down and exploded in a bright, slow bloom of orange fire. The newspapers the next morning called it Flopnik. It was a cruel name and a difficult thing to read over breakfast, but it captured the mood. Something had to change, and in the months that followed, it did. A new agency was formed to lead America's space efforts. It was called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Most people would come to know it simply as NASA. It was built out of an older agency that had spent decades quietly studying aircraft, and it inherited thousands of engineers who had been waiting their whole careers for exactly this kind of mission. Meanwhile, in a quiet town in Alabama, a tall, soft-spoken German engineer named Werner von Braun had been designing rockets for the United States Army. He had designed rockets before, in Germany, during the war. He had complicated history and complicated memories, and he did not always talk about either of them. But he knew, more clearly than almost anyone else alive, how to build a machine that could throw something into the sky and keep it there. And now, finally, the country he now called home was ready to listen to him. By the end of 1958, the United States had managed to place its own small satellite into orbit, a tiny cylinder called Explorer 1, which quietly discovered a belt of radiation circling the Earth. It was a good beginning, but it was still only a beginning. The race was on. And in rooms full of cigarette smoke and drafting tables and black telephones, young engineers began to do the impossible thing. They began to sketch, on long sheets of paper, the shape of a machine that could carry a human being, not just into orbit, but all the way to the moon and back. They did not yet know if it could be done. They only knew that someone was going to try. The first task was simple to describe and almost impossibly difficult to accomplish. Put a human being into space, bring them home alive. The program that attempted this was called Project Mercury, and the people chosen to fly its tiny capsules were called the Mercury 7. They were introduced to the public in April of 1959. 7 men in dark suits standing in a row behind a table covered with models and microphones. They were all military test pilots. They were all, on average, about 5 feet 9 inches tall, because the capsule they would fly was very small and could not accommodate anyone taller. Their names were Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton. The Mercury capsule itself looked a little like an enormous thimble. Inside, it was cramped and hot and loud, with barely enough room for the pilot to move his arms. The couch was molded to the shape of the individual astronaut's body, so that during the roaring press of the launch, his bones and his organs would have something solid and familiar to push against. There were small round windows. There were banks of switches. There was a single periscope that looked down at the Earth below. The first person to reach space, though, was not an American. It was a Soviet Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin. On the 12th of April, 1961, he was strapped into a spherical capsule called Vostok 1 and launched into orbit. He circled the Earth once in a flight lasting about 1 hour and 48 minutes. As the capsule descended, he ejected and parachuted down into a field in the Russian countryside, where he was met by a startled farmer and her granddaughter. They were the first 2 people on Earth to speak to someone who had just been in space. 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard became the first American to reach space. His flight was much shorter. His capsule, named Freedom 7, went up in a long arc and came back down 15 minutes later without ever completing an orbit. But he had done it. He had gone, and he had come back. 20 days after Shepard's flight, the new American president, John F. Kennedy, stood in front of a joint session of Congress and made a promise that would shape the next decade. He said that America should commit itself, before the decade was out, to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period, he said, would be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space. And none would be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. At the time he said these words, the total amount of time an American had spent in space was about 15 minutes. The total amount of time a Soviet had spent in space was not much more. Nobody, on either side, had any real idea how to fly to the moon. The numbers alone were staggering. The moon is, on average, about 238,000 miles from the Earth. A jet airliner flying non-stop would take more than 2 weeks to cover that distance, and the moon is always moving, traveling thousands of miles per hour along its own long, curved path. Hitting it with a rocket was a little like trying to throw a stone at a passing bird, while you yourself were sitting on a spinning merry-go-round in the dark. The engineers at NASA began by working in small, calm steps. Each mission was a lesson. Each mission taught them what they did not yet know. In February of 1962, John Glenn climbed into a capsule called Friendship 7 and became the first American to orbit the Earth. He circled 3 times, watching sunrises and sunsets come around every 90 minutes. At one point, he reported seeing what he described as fireflies floating past his window. Small glowing specks that turned out to be flakes of frozen condensation from the capsule itself, glittering in the morning light as they drifted away. By the middle of the 1960s, Project Mercury had been succeeded by a larger, more ambitious program called Project Gemini. Gemini was named for the twin stars Castor and Pollux, because its capsules carried 2 astronauts instead of 1. The Gemini capsule was larger than the Mercury capsule, though still quite small by any ordinary standard. You could sit in it and you could lie back, but you could not really stand. Over the course of about 18 months, Gemini pilots practiced the things they would need to know how to do in order to reach the moon. They practiced long-duration flight, staying in orbit for up to 2 weeks at a time, eating out of little plastic pouches and sleeping in their couches while the planet rolled quietly past the windows. They practiced walking in space, opening the hatch and floating out at the end of a long tether, with nothing below them but the blue arc of the Earth. They practiced something called rendezvous, which was the delicate art of bringing 2 spacecraft together in orbit and holding them close, nose to nose, at the same speed. Rendezvous was harder than it sounded. In orbit, the ordinary rules of motion stop working the way you would expect. To catch up to something ahead of you, you do not accelerate directly. You descend to a lower orbit first, where your own speed will naturally become faster, and then you rise again. The engineers called these movements the orbital ballet. The astronauts, learning them for the first time, called them many other things. And there were accidents, small and large. One Gemini crew almost lost control of their capsule when a thruster stuck open, sending them into a fast, sickening spin. The pilot, a quiet civilian named Neil Armstrong, kept his voice calm and steady all the way through, and brought the capsule back under control just as he was beginning to lose consciousness. He was not a man who shouted. Almost nothing ever made him shout. By the end of Project Gemini, the American program had caught up to, and in some ways passed, the Soviet one. It had figured out how to rendezvous, how to walk in space, how to stay in orbit long enough for a lunar journey. It was ready, at last, to try the hardest thing. The next program was called Apollo. The name was chosen by a NASA manager named Abe Silverstein, who had been flipping through a book of mythology one evening and thought the image of the Greek god of light riding his chariot across the sky fit the ambition of the mission. Apollo would be the program that carried human beings, for the first time, away from the Earth. The Apollo spacecraft was much larger and more complicated than anything that had come before. It consisted of 3 major pieces. There was a command module, a cone-shaped cabin where the three astronauts would live during the flight. There was a service module, a long cylindrical section behind the command module, which held the main engine, the fuel, the oxygen, and the water. And there was a lunar module, a strange, thin-legged vehicle that looked a little like an insect, which would carry two of the astronauts down to the surface of the moon and back up again. The rocket that would launch all of this was even larger. It was called the Saturn V, and it is, to this day, the most powerful rocket ever flown successfully. It stood 363 feet tall, which is taller than the Statue of Liberty, and it weighed, when fully fueled, about 6.5 million pounds. When its engines lit, the sound of them pressed against the ground so hard that blades of grass a mile away would be flattened by the pressure wave. People who stood at the viewing stands said that you did not so much hear the Saturn V as feel it, deep inside your chest, as if the air itself had turned solid for a moment. In early 1967, the first crewed Apollo mission was being prepared. It was to be called Apollo 1, and it would carry 3 men. Gus Grissom, one of the original Mercury 7, would be the commander. Ed White, who had been the first American to walk in space, would fly in the center seat. And Roger Chaffee, a young Navy pilot who had not yet flown in space, would sit on the right. On the afternoon of January the 27th, 1967, the 3 of them climbed into the Apollo 1 command module, which was sitting on top of a smaller Saturn 1B rocket on Launch Pad 34 at Cape Kennedy. The rocket was not fueled. The flight was not today. Today was what was called a plugs-out test, a long, slow rehearsal in which the spacecraft was running on its own internal power, and the engineers were checking whether all the systems could talk to each other properly. The test did not go smoothly. There were communication problems. The intercom between the astronauts and the launch control room kept crackling and cutting out. At one point, Gus Grissom's voice came through the static with a tired, frustrated remark. "How are we going to get to the moon," he said, "if we cannot talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" It was the sort of comment that a tired pilot made at the end of a long day. Nobody marked it as anything more than that. A few moments later, at about 6:30 in the evening, something went wrong. A small spark, probably from a frayed wire somewhere underneath Grissom's couch, found the pure oxygen atmosphere inside the capsule. Pure oxygen is, under normal circumstances, merely the air we breathe, concentrated. Under pressure, though, it is something else entirely. In a pure oxygen atmosphere, things that would normally only smolder will burst into bright, voracious flame. Velcro will burn. Aluminum will burn, and the small spark, in the instant it touched the wrong thing, became a fire. The fire spread very quickly. The crew had only a few seconds to understand what was happening. The hatch on the Apollo 1 capsule opened inward, which meant that to open it, you had to pull it toward yourself, against the pressure that was now rising inside the cabin. It was not designed to be opened quickly. All 3 men were lost before rescuers could reach them. The news traveled through NASA like a cold wind. Engineers wept openly at their consoles. Grown men who had spent their lives in aviation, who had lost friends to crashes and accidents before, sat in their offices and could not speak. The astronaut corps gathered quietly in small groups and tried to understand what had happened and what it meant for everything they were trying to do. For several months, the Apollo program stopped. Every piece of the spacecraft was taken apart and examined. Thousands of small changes were made. The pure oxygen atmosphere was replaced with a safer mixture for launch. The hatch was redesigned so that it opened outward quickly in about 5 seconds. Flammable materials were removed. Wiring was wrapped in protective sleeves. Inspectors walked through the factories with fresh eyes. There was a feeling, during those quiet months, that the fire had saved the program in a terrible and unwanted way. If it had not happened on the ground, it might have happened in space. And in space, there would have been no way to help. The astronauts who came after Apollo 1 would sometimes say, later in their lives, that they flew safely because 3 men had not. They did not say this lightly. They said it the way a carpenter talks about a tool that was sharpened by someone else long ago. When the Apollo program resumed, it was different. It was quieter and more careful, and in some ways more determined than it had been before. The fire had drawn a line between what had come before and what was about to come next. And on the other side of that line, the real journey to the moon was waiting. The first Apollo mission to carry a crew after the fire was Apollo 7. It launched in October of 1968, almost 2 years after the accident. Its 3 astronauts, Wally Schirra, Don Iserle, and Walter Cunningham, did not go anywhere near the moon. Their job was simply to fly the new command module in orbit around the Earth for 11 days and find out whether all the thousands of changes that had been made had actually worked. They did work. The spacecraft performed well. The engines fired cleanly when asked. The new hatch, the new wiring, the new life support system, the new carefully chosen materials, all of them held together. Schirra, who was a friend of Gus Grissom's and had felt the loss of the Apollo 1 crew particularly deeply, was a difficult, grumpy commander on that flight. He snapped at mission control. He caught a cold in orbit, which is a uniquely miserable thing to have in a weightless cabin because your sinuses do not drain properly. But he brought his spacecraft and his crew home in good order, and the program was ready to go further. What came next was so ambitious that it surprised almost everyone, including many of the engineers at NASA themselves. Originally, Apollo 8 had been planned as a test flight of the lunar module in low Earth orbit. But the lunar module was not ready. It was behind schedule. And an official at NASA named George Low suggested something bold. What if, instead of waiting, they flew Apollo 8 all the way to the moon, without a lunar module, just to go around it and come back? Several people thought this was an extraordinary idea. Several others thought it was reckless. But after weeks of quiet analysis, the decision was made. Apollo 8 would leave the gravity of the Earth altogether. The 3 men chosen to fly it were Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. They launched on the 21st of December 1968 in the middle of a strange, tired year. A year that had been marked by political assassinations and protests and grief. For many Americans watching the launch, it was the first thing in many months that did not feel sad. The Apollo 8 crew spent about 3 days in the long, slow coast across the black emptiness between the Earth and the Moon. They watched the Earth shrink behind them until it was no larger than a blue and white marble held at arm's length. They could cover the entire planet with one thumb. Everyone they loved, everyone who had ever lived, everything any human being had ever done. All of it was a small blue dot behind their window. On Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 slipped behind the moon and lost radio contact with Earth. Ground controllers sat very still, watching clocks, waiting for the signal to return. When it did, a small cheer went around the room. Apollo 8 was now in orbit around the moon, the first humans ever to be so. As they came around the far side, Bill Anders happened to be looking out of his window with a camera in his hands. He saw something he had not expected to see. Rising slowly above the grey, pockmarked horizon of the moon, he saw the Earth. Small, blue, delicate, half in shadow, hanging in the black sky like a Christmas ornament. He took a photograph. It would become one of the most famous photographs ever made. People would call it Earthrise, and they would hang it on walls, print it on stamps, and carry it in their wallets for the rest of their lives. It was the first time most humans had ever seen their own planet from outside. That evening, the 3 astronauts read aloud from the opening verses of the Book of Genesis on live television, to what was then the largest audience in the history of broadcasting. They wished the people of Earth a Merry Christmas and a good night and a safe New Year. Then they fired their engine to leave lunar orbit and began the long coast home. Frank Borman, the commander, would later say that when he looked back at the moon as it shrank in the distance, he felt for the first time truly how far he was from home. Apollo 9 came next, in March of 1969. This time, the lunar module was ready. Apollo 9 did not go to the moon. It stayed in orbit around the Earth and tested whether the lunar module and the command module could separate, fly apart for a few hours, and then come back together again and dock, all while traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. It worked. The lunar module, tested for the first time with people inside it, handled beautifully. Apollo 10 came 2 months later. Apollo 10 did go to the moon. It flew all the way there, entered orbit, and then Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan climbed into the lunar module, undocked from the command module, and flew it down toward the surface. They stopped about 50,000 feet above the moon. They could see the craters and the ridges and the shadows of the landing site with their own eyes. But they did not land. They were not supposed to land. Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal, a final test of every system, a final walkthrough of every step. Some people at NASA said the only reason the Apollo 10 crew did not land was that they had been given a lunar module with not quite enough fuel for a landing and a return, to make certain that the crew would not be tempted. When Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan fired their engines and rose back up to rejoin the command module in orbit, they left behind, on the grey plains below, nothing but their own shadow. The moon had not been touched, not yet. Back on Earth, the next mission was already being prepared. Its launch date was set for July. Its crew had been chosen. Its name was Apollo 11. The 3 men chosen to fly Apollo 11 were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Armstrong was the commander. He was a quiet, private civilian test pilot, the kind of man who said very little and thought a very great deal. Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. He was a precise, methodical engineer with a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Collins was the command module pilot. He was a warm, witty Air Force officer who would not set foot on the moon at all. His job was to stay in orbit, alone, in the command module, while the other 2 went down and came back up. On the morning of July the 16th, 1969, the 3 of them got up early, ate a quiet breakfast of steak and eggs and orange juice, and put on their white pressure suits. They rode a small van out to the launch pad. The Saturn V was waiting for them, steaming in the humid Florida air, a tall white column glistening with frost, where the cold fuel inside met the warm morning outside. They rode an elevator up the side of the rocket. They climbed in through the hatch. They strapped themselves into their couches. The launch was watched, live, by about 600 million people. At the time, this was one of the largest audiences ever gathered for any single event. When the engines lit, at 9:32 in the morning Eastern Time, the ground shook for miles. The rocket rose slowly at first, seeming to hesitate, and then began to climb with a low, steady, inevitable roar. Within 2.5 minutes, it had burned through 2.5 million pounds of fuel and was already 26 miles high. By the end of the next 10 minutes, it was in orbit around the Earth. After 1.5 circuits of the planet, the 3rd stage of the rocket fired again, a long, steady push called the translunar injection, and Apollo 11 left the gravity of the Earth altogether. The 3 astronauts watched the world shrink behind them, the same way Apollo 8 had before. Collins later described it as an odd sensation, a calm, slow, silent slipping away. There was no wind and no noise, just the steady hum of the ship and the blue circle behind them growing smaller. 3 days later, on the afternoon of July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed from the command module into the lunar module, which they had nicknamed Eagle. Collins stayed behind in the command module, which they had nicknamed Columbia. The two ships separated with a gentle puff of gas from small thrusters, and the Eagle began its descent. The descent was not smooth. As the lunar module fell toward the grey surface below, a warning light came on inside the cabin. It was a computer alarm, a number that meant the flight computer was trying to do more work than it could handle, and was having to drop some of its tasks. Armstrong asked Mission Control whether the alarm was serious. In Houston, a young flight controller named Steve Bales had seconds to decide. He had studied all the computer alarms carefully, and he knew this one. He called back, "We are go on that alarm." The landing continued. As the Eagle dropped lower, Armstrong looked out of his small triangular window, and he saw something that worried him. The computer was flying the lunar module directly toward a field of large boulders scattered around the edge of a crater. He did not like the look of it. He reached out, took manual control of the spacecraft, and began flying it himself, searching for a flatter, safer place to land. The fuel gauge began to count down. In Mission Control, the flight controllers watched the numbers and tightened their jaws. 60 seconds, said a voice. A minute of fuel left. Armstrong kept flying, low and slow, across the grey surface. 30 seconds, said the voice. 30 seconds of fuel. In Houston, some of the engineers were whispering, without quite meaning to, "Land, just land." And then, softly, Armstrong's voice came through the speakers. Contact light. A small probe at the bottom of one of the lunar module's legs had touched the surface. A moment later came the words that everyone on Earth had been waiting to hear. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In Mission Control, grown men sat in their chairs with tears running down their faces. Some of them laughed, some of them could not speak. One of the flight directors, Gene Kranz, said later that he had to stop and gather himself for a moment before he could even speak into the loop, because his throat had closed up entirely. Armstrong and Aldrin were supposed to rest before going outside. The flight plan called for a sleep period. Neither of them could possibly sleep. They asked if they could move the first moonwalk earlier. Mission Control said yes. Armstrong opened the small hatch, knelt down, and began climbing backwards down the ladder on the outside of the lunar module. There was a television camera mounted on one of the legs, and as he climbed, it captured grainy black and white pictures of his boots, slowly descending. Back on Earth, several 100 million people sat in living rooms and classrooms and bars and airports, staring at flickering screens, holding their breath. At the bottom of the ladder, Armstrong paused. He reached out with his left foot. He pressed it gently onto the grey dust, and then he stepped down and off the pad and onto the surface of the moon. He said the words he had prepared. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." He had meant to say one small step for a man, but the small word got lost somewhere between his mind and his microphone, and he never much enjoyed hearing the recording afterward. Nobody who listened seemed to care. He described what he saw. The dust was fine, he said, like powdered charcoal. His boots sank only about 1/8 of an inch into it. He could walk around without difficulty. He could see his own footprints clearly. In the low gravity, only 1/6 of Earth's, his body felt light and easy. He moved with a slow, loping motion that was not quite a walk and not quite a hop. A few minutes later, Buzz Aldrin climbed down the ladder and joined him. The two of them stood together on the surface of another world, and for a little while they did not speak. Aldrin looked around at the horizon, at the black, unmoving sky, at the small, bright Earth hanging above them, and described what he saw in 3 words: magnificent desolation. The moon, he said, was magnificent and desolate, both at once. They planted a flag, they collected rocks, they set up scientific instruments, they read aloud the words on a small plaque attached to the lunar module, which said, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." They spoke briefly with the President of the United States, whose voice arrived through the radio as if from a great distance, because it had traveled all the way from the Earth to reach them. They took photographs, and after about 2.5 hours, they climbed back up the ladder, closed the hatch, and went to sleep in the lunar module, which had now become, for one night, the smallest and most remote hotel in the history of travel. In the morning, they fired the engine of the lunar module's ascent stage and rose back up into orbit to meet Michael Collins in Columbia, who had been circling the moon alone for more than 20 hours, sometimes passing behind the far side where no one on Earth could reach him by radio. For about 47 minutes each orbit, he had been, by one measurement, the most isolated human being who had ever lived. The three of them flew home together. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th and were picked up by sailors from an aircraft carrier. They were placed immediately into quarantine because nobody yet knew whether the moon might be carrying some kind of strange germ or infection, and the doctors wanted to be careful. For 3 weeks, they lived inside a small silver trailer, waving at people through a window. And then, at last, they came out and went home. After the triumph of Apollo 11, one might have expected the remaining Apollo missions to feel simpler or calmer. They did not. In some ways, they became more interesting and stranger, and in one case, very nearly a disaster. Apollo 12 launched in November of 1969, less than 4 months after Apollo 11 had returned. The crew was Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean. Pete Conrad was a short, funny, cheerful astronaut who had famously joked about his own height when it was his turn to step onto the moon. The weather on the day of launch was bad. Dark clouds hung low over the Cape. Rain was coming down in sheets. The launch went ahead anyway, because the clouds were not considered dangerous in the usual ways. About 36 seconds after liftoff, the Saturn V rose into the dark clouds and triggered a stroke of lightning. A moment later, it triggered a second one. Inside the command module, every warning light on the instrument panel came on at once. Circuit breakers popped. Alarms rang. The fuel cells, which provided electricity to the spacecraft, tripped offline. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the most powerful rocket ever built was climbing into the sky with most of its electronics confused and half its lights flashing. In mission control, a young flight controller named John Aaron watched the spacecraft's telemetry dissolve into nonsense on his screen. He remembered by coincidence a test he had run years earlier, when an unusual power configuration had produced an identical pattern of strange readings. He called out to the flight director. "Try SCE to auxiliary," he said. This was an obscure setting, so obscure that many of the astronauts had never touched it. Inside the spacecraft, the pilot looking at the instrument panel had no idea where the switch even was. But Alan Bean, sitting in the right seat, happened to remember. He reached up, flipped the switch, and the fuel cells came back online. Apollo 12 continued to orbit and then to the moon. Pete Conrad and Alan Bean eventually landed in a place called the Ocean of Storms, which, despite its dramatic name, was a gentle, dusty plain. They landed within walking distance of an old unmanned American spacecraft called Surveyor 3, which had arrived on the moon more than 2 years earlier. They walked over to it in their clumsy pressure suits and cut off a few pieces of it to bring home. Scientists would later examine those pieces with enormous care to learn how the moon's harsh environment had treated them. Conrad and Bean spent a day and a half on the surface, longer than Armstrong and Aldrin had. Conrad made jokes the entire time. He hummed songs to himself inside his helmet. It was, in his own description, the happiest he had ever been. Then came Apollo 13. Apollo 13 launched in April of 1970. The crew was Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise. Lovell was the commander and had already been to the moon before, on Apollo 8. Swigert was the command module pilot, a quiet bachelor who had been added to the crew at the last minute after another astronaut was exposed to the measles. Haise was the lunar module pilot, a soft-spoken engineer with a careful manner. For the first 2 days, the flight was quiet. So quiet, in fact, that one of the mission controllers in Houston said, on the loop, that Apollo 13 was becoming the smoothest flight of the program. It was the kind of remark that sounds very harmless until you look back on it later. About 56 hours into the flight, when the spacecraft was already closer to the moon than to home, Mission Control asked Swigert to perform a routine procedure. They wanted him to stir one of the oxygen tanks in the service module. This was a simple thing to do, a small toggle switch that ran a fan inside the tank to keep the contents evenly mixed. Swigert reached up and flipped the switch. A few seconds later, there was a sharp bang. The spacecraft shuddered. Warning lights came on. Jim Lovell's voice, steady and unexcited, came through the radio. "Houston, we have had a problem." In the control room, faces turned pale. One of the 2 oxygen tanks in the service module had exploded. Inside that tank, a small piece of damaged insulation left over from an incident during ground testing weeks earlier had caught fire in the pure oxygen environment. The fire had built pressure until the tank ruptured. The explosion had damaged the other tank too, and cut off the supply of electricity and water and breathable air to the command module. Apollo 13 was suddenly dying, very slowly, in the middle of empty space. Mission Control had practiced for hundreds of emergencies during training. They had never practiced for this one. The flight director, Gene Kranz, gathered his people around him. He said calmly that they were going to get this crew home and that failure was not an option. He told his people to stop thinking about what had gone wrong and to start thinking, one problem at a time, about how to bring Apollo 13 back. The solution they arrived at was simple to describe and incredibly difficult to carry out. The command module was dying. It did not have enough power or oxygen to get home. But the lunar module, which had been going along for the ride, was still working. The lunar module had been designed to keep 2 men alive for about 2 days on the surface of the moon. The engineers now had to use it to keep 3 men alive for 4 days, across the longest journey of their lives. The crew moved into the lunar module. They turned off almost everything in the command module, saving its small reserves of power for the return to Earth. They were very cold because the heaters were off. They shivered constantly. The walls of the spacecraft grew damp with condensation from their breath. They could not sleep well. They rationed water, drinking only about 6 ounces a day each, and became dehydrated. Fred Haise developed a fever and became quietly very sick. On Earth, engineers worked in shifts around the clock, building models of the lunar module out of the same materials the crew had with them and figuring out how to solve each new problem. At one point, the carbon dioxide inside the lunar module began to rise to dangerous levels. Because the lunar module's filters were round and the spares from the command module were square. A small team of engineers sat around a table with samples of the items the astronauts had access to: a plastic bag, a flight manual cover, some duct tape, a hose from a pressure suit. And they worked out how to make a square filter fit into a round hole. They called it the mailbox. The instructions were radioed up to the crew, step by step. The crew built it. It worked. The carbon dioxide level began to fall. Apollo 13 swung around the moon without landing. From the windows of the lunar module, Jim Lovell looked down at the lunar surface he had expected to walk on. and watched it slide away beneath him, and said almost nothing. Then, with their fuel and their air and their patience running out, the crew fired the lunar module's descent engine to push themselves back toward the Earth. 4 days after the explosion, they re-entered the atmosphere of Earth. The re-entry was long and silent because radio signals do not pass through the hot plasma that surrounds a returning spacecraft. Mission Control waited, and waited, and waited. The normal blackout period was about 3 minutes. This time it stretched to 4 minutes. 5 minutes. Nobody in the control room was moving. And then, at last, the radio crackled back to life. The parachutes opened. Apollo 13 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean close to the recovery ship. The crew was alive, exhausted, dehydrated, cold, and alive. It was one of the great rescues of the 20th century, and to this day it is sometimes called, with only a small exaggeration, NASA's successful failure. Apollo 14 came next, in early 1971. Its commander was Alan Shepard, the same man who, almost exactly a decade earlier, had ridden the tiny Mercury capsule up into the sky for 15 minutes. In the intervening years, he had been grounded by an inner ear problem, which a delicate surgery had eventually repaired. He was now in his late 40s, older than most astronauts, and he had waited a very long time to fly again. His crew was Stuart Rooser and Edgar Mitchell. Apollo 14 landed in a region called Fra Mauro, which was the landing site that Apollo 13 would have reached if it had gone according to plan. The descent was not smooth. A small radar problem nearly caused the mission to abort at the last moment, but the engineers on the ground figured out a workaround in time. Shepard and Mitchell walked on the moon for about 9 hours. In his last moments before climbing back up the ladder, Shepard took out a small folding tool with a golf club head attached to the end and 2 golf balls he had smuggled on board and hit them across the lunar landscape. One of them, he said, went miles and miles and miles in the low gravity. Later, careful photographic analysis would show that it actually went only about 40 yards. But nobody begrudged him the story. Apollo 15 came in the summer of 1971. This was the first of the longer, more scientific expeditions to the moon. The crew was David Scott, Alfred Worden, and James Irwin. They landed in a place called Hadley Ryle, at the foot of tall lunar mountains, and they stayed on the surface for almost 3 full days. They brought with them, for the first time, a small electric vehicle called the Lunar Rover. It was a sort of dune buggy designed for the moon, with wire mesh wheels and a small umbrella-shaped antenna. They drove it across the grey plains at about 8 miles per hour, exploring much more ground than any crew before them. Before they left the moon, Dave Scott performed a small experiment that Galileo had once imagined. On live television, he held a hammer in one hand and a feather in the other. He dropped them both at the same time. On Earth, the feather would have drifted slowly while the hammer fell. On the moon, with no air resistance, the 2 objects fell together at exactly the same rate and hit the dust at exactly the same instant. It was a small, beautiful moment. Scott said afterward that it was proof that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings. Apollo 16 flew in April of 1972. John Young commanded, with Ken Mattingly in the command module and Charlie Duke on the lunar module. They landed in a highland region called Descartes and spent about 3 days there. The scientific yield was rich. They drove the rover across nearly 17 miles of terrain and collected more than 200 pounds of lunar samples. On the last day, Charlie Duke left behind a small photograph of his family, tucked into the dust, with a note on the back that said, "This is the family of astronaut Duke from planet Earth who landed on the moon in April 1972. It is still there. The photograph has probably faded by now in the harsh ultraviolet sunlight, but the dust it rests on has not moved." And then came Apollo 17. The final Apollo mission, Apollo 17, launched at night in December of 1972. It remains to this day the only Saturn V ever to launch after dark. The rocket rose from the pad in a brilliant white column of fire that lit up the entire coast of Florida like a false sunrise. The crew was Eugene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Harrison Schmitt. Schmitt was the first actual scientist, a professional geologist, to fly to the moon. Cernan was the commander. He was a warm, expressive man who had flown on Apollo 10 so close to the surface that he had wanted, more than anything, to come back. Now, at last, he had come back. Apollo 17 landed in a valley called Taurus Littrow, surrounded by tall, silent mountains. The crew spent 3 days there. They drove the lunar rover more than 20 miles. They collected samples of an orange soil, which turned out to be ancient volcanic glass, nearly 4 billion years old. They set up scientific experiments that would keep sending data back to Earth for years. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist, had a great deal of fun. He recognized landforms and rocks in the same unhurried way a good naturalist recognizes birds in a garden. He hummed sometimes when he worked. On the third day, at the end of their final moonwalk, Gene Cernan climbed back up the ladder of the lunar module. Before he did, he knelt in the dust and wrote his daughter's initials there with his finger. He knew the mark would remain unchanged for millions of years. There is no wind on the moon, no rain, no erosion. In a certain sense, his daughter's initials are still there now, exactly as he drew them. Before he stepped onto the bottom rung, he said a few careful words, prepared but not overly rehearsed. He said, "As I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I would like to just say what I believe history will record. That America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon at Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." He climbed up, he closed the hatch, the ascent engine fired, and the small lunar module rose slowly from the dust, leaving behind the rover, the scientific instruments, the flag, the footprints, and the initials in the soil. Nobody has walked on the moon since. There were supposed to be more missions. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 had been planned, but budgets were cut. Public interest had moved on. The stunning had become familiar, and then, in the way familiar things do, quiet. NASA began to look toward the space shuttle, toward orbital stations, toward other horizons. The Apollo hardware that would have flown on the later missions was placed into museums and hangars. The astronauts who had trained for them eventually moved on to other careers. Over the course of less than 4 years, 12 human beings had walked on the surface of another world. 3 more had stayed in lunar orbit while their crewmates walked below. In all, about 24 people had traveled beyond the Earth's gravity well, further than any humans had ever gone. They brought back about 842 pounds of lunar rocks and dust, most of which is still being studied today in quiet laboratories around the world. Some of the samples have never been opened. They are waiting for future scientists with future instruments who may be able to ask questions we do not yet know how to ask. The men who flew to the moon came home changed. Not all of them would describe the change in the same way. Some of them became more religious. Some of them became more scientific. Some of them became painters or environmentalists or quiet private citizens who rarely spoke about what they had seen. Ed Mitchell said that when he looked back at the Earth on the way home, he felt a sudden, deep, overwhelming sense that everything was connected. Buzz Aldrin said that after coming back from the moon, he sometimes felt lost, uncertain what could possibly come next. Michael Collins said that the Earth, seen from the window of a spacecraft, looks so small and fragile that you want to reach out and protect it with your hand. Alan Bean, the fourth man to walk on the moon, spent the rest of his life as a painter. He painted the lunar surface in bright, glowing colors that the actual surface does not have, because he said that the colors he remembered in his heart were not the colors his eyes had actually seen. He said he wanted his paintings to show what the experience had felt like, rather than what it had looked like. Some of his paintings include tiny fragments of the moon mixed into the paint itself. They are, in a very literal sense, pieces of the moon hanging on the walls of Earth. The moon is still there. It rises most nights over the fields and the cities and the quiet houses, the same moon that has circled the Earth for billions of years. If you step outside on a clear night and look up, you can see with your own eyes the places where those men walked. You cannot see their footprints from here, of course, but the footprints are there, calm, unchanging, waiting in the cold dust of an old and quiet world. For now, the story of Apollo has ended. New stories are being written, new rockets are being built, new crews are training, right now, in buildings not so very different from the ones Armstrong and Aldrin trained in. Someday soon, in a future not so very far from here, other human beings will walk on the moon again. They will look at the old tracks in the dust, and at the flags, perhaps a little faded but still standing. They will read the words on the plaque at Tranquility Base, and they will, in their own way, continue the long, slow, patient journey outward that Apollo began. But that story is for another night. For tonight, you do not have to go anywhere, or think about anything, or remember any of this. The story is over. The lights are low. Your breath is slow. The old moon is somewhere above you, exactly where it has always been, turning gently in its long and patient orbit. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.